Hello. Okay, so I am going to invite Brian and Andreas to just hang with us and let us just connect like we are all doing right now virtually. Okay. Okay. Hey, you guys. Hey, Jane. I'm so glad you guys are here. I just got to wait for Brian. And let's see, we're having this is our first time doing this, which may not have been the smartest thing on Shay's part, but it's what she did. So let us find him. Brian. Okay. So let me tell him to go. Let's see. Brian. Come. Okay, let's see. Hey guys, thanks so much for coming here. I can't wait till he gets here. I am in love with this man in the most beautiful, pure way. There he is. Oh my gosh, there he is, Brian Andreas. We're just waiting for him. He's going to be way more interesting than I am. Hey there, Brian.
Hi, how are you?
How are you doing?
Good, we're doing fine.
Hey, Fia, how are you doing?
Good.
You guys, this is so awesome. I just want to tell everybody, they've never met me before. I'm just some random girl from the Bahamas who lives in Charlotte who has followed you, Brian, since I was in my early 20s. And your musings and drawings have been absolutely critical to my adult life. And so I just want to tell people real quick who you are. And I also want to tell them how kind you are for speaking to me. So Brian Andreas is this brilliant, beautiful mind that does these beautiful drawings and words.
That needs a haircut.
Because I love the hair, by the way. I love it. And actually, might I just say, that you guys both look better in person than you did on your photos, because you know how to do my little research. And Fia, you look fantastic over there.
Thank you.
So I'm serious. So I learned about Brian. He has these beautiful drawings. I put them on my Instagram feed, and I'm like, this guy, his words mean so much to me. What I'm trying to tell you, Brian, is your snapshots of life in the pursuit of life, sometimes you would articulate it as if you were in my mind, and you gave words to feelings I've had over the years, thoughts I've had, and you brought it together so lovingly. So I just want to say, this is who this man is, and he's done this for millions of people. And how I met him, and I'm meeting them today, is I honestly just reached out to him because right now we're in an unprecedented, crazy time. None of us know what we're doing, but we know that we fundamentally want to connect. And I know from you, Brian, that you are a fundamentally connected person. So that is who you are. Now I just like to ask some questions, and I want us just to have some good shining light on this time. I love it. What's the dog's name?
That's Yoshi.
Yoshi. Hey, Yoshi. How old is Yoshi?
I think he's 7. Yeah. He's a
Belgian
shepherd.
So
Yeah, good.
I love it, Yoshi.
He says, I can't smell her. I can't.
He can't, but he can see me. Hey, Yoshi. Hey, Yoshi. I smell like I took a shower. Look at that. They follow Fia and Brian daily on Gia Ingot. I love, love, love them. So I had a quick question. So do you ever watch podcasts, Brian?
Not really.
Thank you. Yes. If you could, Fia, you could come a little bit more into the camera because you're on the side. Yeah, girl, do it. Lean in.
Yes. Odd chairs. How about this?
That's beautiful. Yes, that's beautiful. I love it. Yes, yes, I love it.
And then turn a little left, and then make it look natural.
Yes, we all do that. Is the lighting all right?
Oh my God. Okay.
So there's this podcast that I listen to, and it's called The Moth. It's just this moth, and it was started by this guy. I think his name is Brian Dawes Green, or Brian Green Dawes. Anyway, the idea, he's this Southern guy who moved to New York City, and he realized that when he got to the city, that there were few places where people could just connect like they did in the South on the front porch, staying
Right.
up late and telling stories late into the night until the moths came around the light. So hence the name The Moth. So it started off in New York City apartments, just people telling stories of their lives. But I know that you realize that stories connect us, right? And I just listened to a story the other day that it is going to be my jumping point in asking you the same question. So I listened to this great little story on my drive to work before they told us we couldn't go. And it was about this young lady who, her experience with her father when she was like 5 years old. And it was this beautiful story of her having this day with him, and he took her for some chocolate like he always did. But in the end, her father ended up committing suicide, right? And she carried this depth of a story with her whole life, and felt like she was the reason why he did this. And finally, when she was in her 30s, she got strength to share the words on a stage that she had never done before. She did it. And a lady wrote her from Australia saying to her, I have been in the bowels of depression for the longest time. And I was just in the bathroom with a handful of tablets while my little toddler son was napping in his room. And I was ready to take these tablets and take my life. And I heard your story, and it made me go, I didn't want my son's story to be your story. So our stories actually change each other's lives, right? So my question to you, Brian and Fia, I would love to hear, what is a story that you have lived that you found has been transformative for you or others? Just something that's happened in your life. It doesn't have to be anything shiny.
Just, like just like a really easy question.
I know.
Let's do a softball. So, what's your favorite color?
Just ease into that. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to add on to sort of the bio of things, both of us have told stories in our own way for a very long time.
Yeah.
So when the two of us ran into each other and our lives meshed, it was like, it was basically a match made in story heaven. So,
yes. I
the
love
funny
it.
thing is, even when she looks at me that way, it's because we have very different takes on story.
Okay. What are the different takes when you say that? What do you mean?
That's one of those, I hesitate to say that this is Fia's take and this is mine. I can say what mine is.
Sure.
I love stories that we'll often talk about Navajo rug weavers. And the Navajo rug weavers leave a section always undone, because it's where the Great Spirit enters. So it's never fully complete. It's not, there's not perfection. That's where so from how I look at story, it's not a whole and complete story if there's not, as Fia would say, if there's not oxygen in it, if there's not space for people to come in, then the story itself isn't really useful. Because in the end, it's not my story. It's not like, and I think anybody who goes through storytelling over a period of time figures this out. In the beginning, you want to tell your story. It's important. This is my story. And the more you tell them, the more you go, well, yeah, it actually isn't my story, because if it were, then it wouldn't change every time I tell it to different people.
Right.
Really, what you find is that a story is something that is an intersection between your being and this other person's being, and so the story exists in a third space. There is no one story that you tell again and again and again. And if it is, it's more an exercise in you
Memorization.
Well, no, that, but also in you hanging on to, like, life has to be this way.
Yeah,
sure.
We think of stories sometimes, I think, in the same way we think of fairy tales, where once they are, that's how they are.
Yeah.
I go grab this book from the shelf, the book, the words are in there, and that is what the story is. You know, it even sounds like this woman. It started here, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened.
Right.
I think that, this idea of oxygen is, I think it's number one, the way we remember it. But the other thing is, you know, the thing is, I can't think of a story that has stayed the same because they keep unraveling.
That's right.
Because the people keep changing, or my perspective keeps changing.
Yeah.
That changes, you know, the stories about my grandmother, where I think, oh, I didn't see her as a woman.
Right.
As a grandmother.
That's right.
About her relationship with my grandfather, and I think, well, of course she made that decision.
Right.
I understand that now, and something opens up, and it all begins to fall away. And so there are these idea of our memories is they're not static, and this idea of stories is that stories can pin us in place as much as they free us. And so this idea of really allowing some elasticity in the story feels more human.
It does.
Involved, because I think those are the reasons that people continue not to talk to each other, or continue to gravitate towards particular parts of town, or, you know, or they avoid different stations on the radio. Mm-hmm. And it's all because things get kind of stuck in that way.
Mm-hmm. And also some radio stations are pretty bad.
Well, no.
Right. So what you're saying, Fia, I just want to make sure that I encapsulate it, because I think that there's something really beautiful there. What you're saying is you start seeing people gravitating towards certain places and people and things because of the story that stays static, and it's resonating with where they are, and they refuse to move elsewhere.
Yes, and it's the same thing with relationships. I wish I remembered who had told me this, because I remember reading it, and I thought I never really thought about relationships the same since. She said, you know, when people leave for work, well, we used to leave for work for the day.
Right.
You leave the relationship at a particular point, and then you both go off and have your own day, and, you know, kids go off and have their own day, and they come back, and they've had a whole body of experiences.
Right.
But you come back, and the last way I remember, you know, I might remember Brian, is from that last moment before we said goodbye and one of us went out the door. Right. And that's kind of this idea of relationships too. We get stuck in relationships, I think, too. This idea of the story of what this is.
And what it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of continuing, always being this elastic
thing. You know, it's a living thing is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a living thing, right? It's a living document that's always changing and transforming. Exactly. And I think it is the living, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, and that's one of the things where we work with story all the time. And what happens is when you play with story, and as Fia says, it's elastic, when you start understanding that, then that actually ripples out into your life. You go, oh, wow, that story I just told to, you know, our post person, and then I told later to my mother, same story at core, but, you know, they adapted, and then you start going, oh, wow, the entire thing, the entirety of my life is as fluid as that.
Well, the other thing, too, about story is that it's all about perspective.
Yes.
Right? So right even this moment right now, all of us that are here, we would all say, oh, this is what was in the room. This is what I saw was in the room. This is what they talked about. And every single story would be different.
And every single story would be accurate.
Correct. And every single story would be false.
Yeah, right. At the same time. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So meaning like they are telling their truth, and yet they have very different tellings of the stories, right?
People get confused between story and truth.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing about, and part of it has to do with neuroscience, because the way that we understand things is that we have to create meaning. Yes. Rather than simply looking at the data. We can't let it just be data. We have to actually arrange it. And what happens in the brain is that when there's a gap, a piece of information missing, we have to fill it in. We fill it in with an assumption. We fill it in with something we believe, something we fear.
That is good.
We're missing. So this idea of information, especially right now, and accurate information, but even that gets a little slippery.
Yeah.
That all feeds into
story. I saw it on TV. It must be true.
Right. I Googled it.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
Definite.
So all that feeds into story also.
So, you know, Fia.
We didn't answer the question. Okay. We get that we didn't answer your question.
No, I love it though. But, you know, there was something you said earlier, Brian. You were saying, you know, like how, you know, our stories, I think I think you teed it up and then Fia went into it. Basically, are you saying that in the malleableness of the story, is that how we connect to each other? Do we connect because the story is actually transforming and it's changing, or do we connect on the static point?
No, okay. Well, we obviously my view of it is that this it's what we call the third space. The story happens in that third space. I mean, an example of that is when we're talking to you right now, or we're talking on the phone. When I talk to a friend on the phone, are they there in my space, or am I there in their space?
Sure.
Or is it this third place that we both imagine ourselves into?
Yeah.
Inhabit. So story, in my view, is that place that we inhabit, that we it's not an actuality, it's not true. Like you and I did, if I told you a story or you told me a story,
sure,
you would hear it differently. I'd speak it one way, you'd hear it another way. You'd speak yours, I'd hear it another way. But at the same time, we've created this thing together. So this third entity is connect, but we connect there in the way we have to co-create it.
Right. You know, so it's something you said earlier, I think, to that point of like, early on, you want to tell your story. This is my story, I got to tell it. But as you grow in your life and you expand, you start really like, I think what you're saying is, this was my takeaway, that the stories essentially belong to us all.
Yeah, that's one way of saying it.
We're kind of, so then you are less apt to hold on to your narrative and your truth, like with an iron grip.
Oh, you just said something that was really interesting. Your narrative and your truth. Those are not the same thing.
Okay, tell me.
Your narrative is not your truth.
It's not true.
And this would be one of those things we could sort of wrangle.
Let's do it. Tell me what the distinction is for you.
I don't think you discover your truth. It's a constant experiencing of your truth. I don't think there is, anytime you say this is my truth, that's a narrative. That is not your truth. Your truth is the experience of, like when you taste something, you go out to a meal and you have something that you've never really had before, and you taste it, and you're trying to put words to it, but you really can't put words to it at the very same time you've tasted it, and you will never not be able to taste that again.
Yeah.
There's an experience of our lives that is the truth of us.
And you're like, that is the truth.
Yeah, but putting the words to it automatically starts going,
the narrative.
Here's the narrative about what
I like that.
Language happens after.
Right.
Language can't ever really fully hold the experience, the full body experience of it.
Yeah.
And so as soon as we put words on it, and we, it's that feeling of languages that are not your own, and how I think they're intoxicating. I love that, because they never fully translate.
They don't.
It's magical.
I know, it is. It's amazing.
It feels like a whole other way of being that another culture has discovered, pioneered. Which I think is really fabulous. And so that's this idea of story and narrative. And it's like saying, well, this is what my job is. And you think, that is not my job. My job is like 50 million other things.
Right.
But I say, okay, I'm a secretary, but that does not say what I do.
Right.
Not my identity. And so it's the same thing with the idea of narrative and truth and identity and story and all of these words we've kind of attached to it to try to understand, because we want to know what it is and what it means, and we feel like it's supposed to be the thing that we carry, that we can tell somebody about us in order for them to know us, rather than just simply spend time with us.
Or to take an identity too, because that's the other thing. When early on, I would never say there's a right way or wrong way to do this.
Sure.
Someone saying, this is my story, this is my truth. It's like, there is a very powerful thing of taking back your own story.
Yeah.
And we all do it. I mean, we take it back for ourselves individually. We take it back as a culture.
Why is that important?
Wait, I don't think about it as taking it back, because it was never gone. If you're actually saying it, because nobody can ever take that from you, I don't think. Because it's not possible physiologically within the body.
Go ahead, Fia.
Physiologically, so nobody can make me feel anything. If I, that thing about like, oh, you made me feel that physiologically possible. It runs against science.
How
Different
I feel.
Oh,
Not-
no, it is
You
different
can't
thing.
take my story. What you can do is I can allow myself to be silent about this particular aspect.
Okay.
And then when I actually speak it aloud, somebody says, oh, you took it back. And I think, no, I just finally spoke it out loud.
Ooh.
That's the difference.
No.
Nobody ever takes my story.
Okay.
I never have to take it back.
Okay. Let me. All right.
It is with me all the time.
I like that distinction. But
I like it too. Go ahead, Fia.
Here's where I would not counter it, but
Counter it.
ask you. No, I'm not going to counter it, but because
That's
I
great,
think
because I'm right.
I already know that. Oh, I am not worthy.
I'm so kidding. I'm so kidding.
I love this, you guys. This is awesome. This is needed right now. This is magic. Keep going.
Oh my God. Sorry,
It's okay. So I think that is a good distinction, that it was misspeaking, that taking okay, I don't blah 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 blah.
Right.
What about this? What about when you have taken on a story that's not yours, even though internally you have a different experience, a different sense? What about there? Because I know in the trajectory of my own life where I have taken on a story that it took me, 25 years ago.
Can you tell us something? I like, what kind of story are you meaning so that we take it out of the ethereal? Because this is a hefty and wonderful conversation, but I want people to have strong takeaways. We have got to take it out of the ethereal and bring it into an experience. Can you please tell me what you mean by that?
No, I'm happy to do that. I don't know if you heard her.
No, what'd she say?
Her sotto voce comment in the background. So one of the things we'll often talk about because we go back and forth in writing our story every day. And she'll write something, I'll go, well, it's pretty abstract. There's no concrete linkage. And so she just nailed me. She said, well, it's pretty abstract.
Right. Just because that's the only way to my question that I asked you earlier, although you didn't answer it yet, but you will. That's the only way people can connect, right? I think that a part of the power of story, regardless of whether you are in the narrative of story or the truth, the power of it is it connects us.
Yeah.
It connects us. So I love where you both are going. And I know that the people who are watching are loving it. They're saying, and we're going to make sure it's available so people can see this conversation. I would like to think of these as kind of fireside chats that my 6th grade teacher taught me about. Like, these are places where people can come and be. But what you said was, in your particular story, I need you to share a particular story that you mean that you can use it as the example of what you're talking about to help teach us. Because right now I'm hearing a lot of deeply evocative thoughts. And I mean, it's very heady. It is cerebral at best, but, and I love it. But make the person, like my mother from Detroit, Michigan, my father from Exuma, Bahamas, not formally educated people, didn't exist in the catacombs of universities and language. Why is it important? Why is the telling of the stories? Why is it important? And when you said, there was something you said earlier, I'll come back to it, but essentially, why is it important? I need you to connect with us on a story of yours or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Oh yeah, it completely makes sense. Partly where we go when we're even in this conversation, when we're tangling around the nature of story, is that we play with the concrete details of story all the time.
Right.
And there's the tangling with, well, what were you doing there, and why were you doing that? And so that's a completely fair thing that you're saying.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what's going to be a useful story? What I was referring to is that I had a story. Wow, there's a whole thread. The thing that comes up is I was going to start with a different story, but this is the thread that comes up. Is that I'm a firstborn child.
Okay.
So I was the one that across the the generations. I mean, for, I was the first grandchild.
Mm-hmm.
I was the first of the multiple aunts and uncles, the child to be born.
So the first cousin, first child, first. I get it.
Yeah.
First
Yeah.
grandson.
So I was, so my experience was of being basically put on, on a wedding cake, on a wedding cake when you're the little
yes.
one.
Propped up for all to see.
Yeah. So I was there, and in a good way,
Mm-hmm.
in a good way, generally. But then in the background, there was how I got the message from my father over the from the time I was very young to my teens, of how I was a reflection of him. Mm. And I needed to be well behaved and well disciplined and be somebody who listened and was articulate and had good grades, and generally, because I reflected well or poorly on him.
Yeah.
And so I can go, that perhaps is still abstract, but no, I can bounce all over the place. So he would often tell the story. He was still in college at when I was born at University of Iowa, and so he would run track in the field house, and he would take me and sit me on the bleachers when I was 18 months old. Mm. He would sit me on the bleachers and he would tell me to stay there. And he said, the story was that he told constantly, so it's like I grew up with this.
Mm-hmm. You probably had memory of it too at a certain point. You know how a story is?
But I think what I have is the memory of it being told.
Absolutely.
I don't necessarily have the memory of the
Absolutely.
actual.
That's what I mean. It's like when the story is told so often, you start creating memory around it, and you're like, wait, I don't really remember this. It's almost as if I was there, but I've been told it so many times.
Right. To my point, to my earlier point.
Go ahead, Brian. Bring it.
No,
bring it.
I understand that we have a different point of view, and there's the right one, and there's yours. So anyway, back to...
I'm going to have to be on Fia's side on this one.
No, that is so not true.
I see it, Fia.
Yeah, it is so not true. So the story was that I sat there on the bleachers, and he would run, on a 220-yard track, and I would stay there, and I was disciplined enough, even at an early age, to keep myself occupied. Yeah. And to listen carefully and be well behaved. So that was what, it's like I had that always in the background. And it wasn't until...
And probably informed a lot of your choices and your behaviors.
Oh, yeah, of course. All of our stories do. I mean,
yep.
When it comes right down to it, what you believe forms exactly your behavior. If you believe something, you're going to make your decisions around your behavior based on what you believe.
That's right.
So yes, of course it did. It wasn't until I was in my mid-50s and working with a friend of mine in Santa Barbara who had just come back from ayahuasca training in the Amazon. Ooh. And she walked in and we talked a little bit about this, and then she turned to me, and I hadn't noticed beforehand, but her pupils were about the size of $50, and she looked at me and she said, "You do not even see yourself, do you?" And it's like with one of those voices, like I'm channeling a 4,000.
Yeah. Right.
And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, that, and I had never told her the story of this. And she said, that thing about you being well behaved, you were terrified of doing the wrong thing. Mm. So you were trying to do it right. It's like, how much of a life have I used being right? I don't do it anymore. I refuse to be right.
That's awesome.
So that's one of those where that's not the story I tell. That's not the way it's not what I believe. It's not how I act anymore.
Yeah.
The difference between those two stories is radically, there's a radical split there.
There is. No, I appreciate that. Fia, do you have something similar? Because it looks like you have something.
Yeah. Well, the two things that came up, there are two things that came up. One of them is, and it's not my story to tell, so I'm going to be vague around it. But
Yeah.
I would say that a couple years ago, my mom and I were having coffee on the porch, and it was one of those kind of early morning coffees. You know, you have those kinds of conversations only early in the morning or late at night. They can only happen in the dark.
Yes. Yes.
You know, and so she revealed a lot of truths that happened to her as a woman that I had never known.
Right.
Like, never, ever known. I had never known, I'd never heard anybody in my family speak this.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, and something in me just released, and I thought, all of the frustrations I had had about the mom she was, or the mom she wasn't, or who I wanted her to be, just let go, because I thought, you did the absolute best you could. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, Fia. Pause on that.
Thing, but
She
yeah.
did the absolute. That, I think the reason why I say pause on that is because I think in the living of our stories, since they're living documents and they're ever changing and growing, the living of our story, we are all doing the best we can with what we have, where we are, no matter how horrible it is. May I share a story? So for me, I like Brian, I love how you said, you know, I don't tell that story anymore. There was a clear faction before and after, kind of like AD and BC, like, no, it doesn't happen anymore. So for me, a part of my narrative, I married a man who is white, right? And he's from the South. And his family was super happy. No, they weren't. And they were really very unkind to me, very unkind. And it is my story. And there were times when I felt so bad, again, to own it. I'm not saying the things they said, I walked away feeling a certain way. The things they did, I left often feeling less than, or certainly, and often attacked and treated unkindly and poorly. And to not to belabor this, but this is where it changed for me. I was like one day just like really ticked off. Like, I am so tired of this treatment and this behavior, you know, telling me how lucky I am. Like every day I would hear how lucky I was to have been married to their son. Nobody was lucky to be married to me. And I'd say that a lot of people actually think that I'm pretty cool, Fia, you know, and pretty interesting and pretty, and also pretty. How about that one? And it was just really a difficult time for me. But this is the thing that helped me, is at one point I heard in my heart, I don't know what you would call it, but at one point I heard in my heart, his mother was particularly difficult for me to interface with, particularly difficult. And to you, Brian, how you were the first, I married a man who is his mother's and father's only son. His parents are now divorced. He is his mother's only son. He is her firstborn, and he is his father's only child.
See, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered who you were.
Right. I already was up against
that. Just exacerbated.
Absolutely. I just want to say, so to that point, I'm already marrying this first, who is like propped up on top of the wedding cake, like you said. But then, who the first is marrying looks like me. And, and so now we're just going to launch onto a whole other thing of treatment, right? And basically give ourselves a reason as to why we're doing it, you know? So now here's this very salient reason as why I'm treating this girl this way. So I'm telling you this to make this short. At some point in my pain and in my frustration, I heard so clearly, Shay, listen, every person who loved her, who raised her when she fell off of her bike, who bandaged up her knee, who celebrated her first birthday with her, who took her out for her sweet 16, every person in the catacombs of her memory and source believed how she believes. And when you come, You scare her, baby girl. You scare her because you make her have to call them liars. And she is not going to eradicate and break up her story. So I was a juggernaut to her story. And once I got that, it was a little freeing for me. It wasn't that her behavior really changed, but I got that it had nothing to do with me. It's that I scared her because if she accepted me, she would call them a liar. And she was ill prepared to do that.
Well, and it's exactly what you're saying. So it's another very human thing that we are solution finders.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is that this is where the beliefs come in, right? So if I believe this to be, and this is something that we actually had, we had an incident.
An incident.
I would call it. It was uncomfortable. I was angry.
I want to hear about this incident.
And it was, you know, and what it was is there was a person, and I can probably say this because she's probably never going to be working with us, but that at his old company, and she got very angry with me. She was older. She got very angry with me and like would not even talk to me. It was the kind of thing where literally we would be right here and she would look to Brian and only talk to him.
Right,
and just
like you didn't exist here.
And I was like right there.
I mean,
right.
Actually, at one in a room less than 3 feet apart.
Yeah.
And at no point did she acknowledge Fia.
No.
And can I just say how awkward and weird that is? Because, you know, like when you get in the elevator and nobody looks at each other and everybody ignores and it feels so uncomfortable. The reason why it's uncomfortable is because it's not normal to ignore another living human being.
Right.
It's
not normal.
It really isn't. And especially for me, because when I am like direct, I just say, let's just call out the pink elephants in the room so we can I'm not afraid of conflict.
I love it.
The way we get to the next place, because obviously we're at a place and we want to get to another place. So you got to be able to talk about it.
Yeah.
But there was no talking about it. And so, you know, it was one of those things where I had to go back into my acting history and I thought, okay, so if I'm playing this woman, what has to be true in her world for this to be a solution?
Yes.
And as soon as I did that, I thought, well, okay, so she's in her 60s. She's being asked to do a something very, very new.
That she probably feels inept or incapable of doing.
Yep. And her husband had passed. And so
lonely.
She was alone, and so she had, you know, and she was also used to being the one in the room that had all the answers.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, if those things were true in my world, and somebody new came in and said, because what had happened is I had rearranged something on her desk.
Right.
That was the only thing I did. I rearranged while she was out of town. I needed to borrow like a stapler, and I put it back in the wrong place.
Stapler.
And I was like, shit, are you fucking kidding me?
Right? No, don't excuse me, say it.
But then I thought, you know what though? If this is my space, my workspace, and this is the one thing I can control in my life, then yeah, that would be really upsetting.
Right.
It would be disrespectful.
And it would be disrespectful. And I thought, you know what? You bet I can totally honor your desk. I can apologize for that, and I can completely make space so that I honor that space, because honoring that space is honoring her. But the only way I could get there is to look at her behavior not as wrong, but by saying what has to be true for her in order for this
to be a viable result. Yeah.
Right,
a resolution.
And what it did is it grew me.
Yeah.
It actually grew me, but I couldn't get there any other way if I saw myself as a victim, if I saw myself as right. And you know what I mean? Like,
oh, absolutely. I call it sitting in the seat of awareness. When we sit in the seat of awareness, we sit in the seat of power. So you're aware. And that's essentially what, go ahead, brother. Break it down for me, Brian.
I just want to add. Yeah, we have to keep
No, I get it. Go on.
It wouldn't have ever worked if Fia had been adamant about her story being more
the
important.
Only one and being the correct one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
Never.
and I loved how you say it again, Brian. Sorry.
There would be never any movement. I had a psychologist that I saw in Santa Barbara when I first was going through my divorce, who said, you know, because I was like, and she did this and she did that,
right.
And she said, oh, I hear that. You know, I remember learning how to dance, and my dance instructor said, your partner and you will dance perfectly together, but it's always the two of you. And it was like, oh, fuck. That so messes with things. That's
right.
Just, that messes with it. It's like, oh, yeah.
Right.
You always dance with, you dance perfectly with the other person. So it's never it's never
anybody's
issues.
fault.
Right. Absolutely. But I just really loved how you dismantled it by understanding what would have to be true for her for that to be proper behavior or a resolution. And that's essentially exactly what I did with my mother-in-law. I had to realize what was her truth, and then what did I represent to that truth. And if that was my truth, I would have a hard time calling my ancestors liars too.
Right.
I'm not even saying that she's correct, but it allows me to have a sense of compassion for her. So now I'm no longer the victim of her behavior. I'm aware of who she is. I'm aware of the place that she moves from in her thoughts. I'm aware of what I represent to that world. So it honestly, it didn't bother me anymore. It really didn't. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that I hung out there and allowed myself to be treated. I have a way of saying this. Because we can't control people, right? So what I like to say is, I'm no longer comfortable being treated the way that you are comfortable with treating people. I'm like, you can keep doing that. I'm just no longer comfortable with it.
Right. Well, and I think, this idea of changing people, again, we can't. Again, somebody can agree to change their behavior because of information that's come into the space.
Right.
But we can't physically change somebody. We would never want that power, ever.
Yeah.
And we ought never give that power.
Right.
Well, it's like the psychologist again. She didn't say, "Oh, that's really stupid. You doing that? That's really stupid." She just said, "Hey, this is how dancing works." And it's like, and I got to make the leap.
Right.
So once you make the leap into a new story, or a new version of your story, it's like your behavior changes really rapidly. But people change instantly with different beliefs.
And that's the thing, though, too. It's also acting like we're not already always connected.
Right.
What changes is if we see it or if we don't. It's like the clouds, right? The sun is always there. That blue sky is always there, even in a thunderstorm. But
I like
whether we see it or not, that's up to our perspective in this.
And right now, what do you think's happening right now? Where's the sun?
It's there. I mean, it's right here in Montana, but it's definitely, I mean, it's here. I find myself asking that a lot right now because I can't get a handle on what has to be true in order for people to be speaking this way to each other in our country. I don't recognize it. And I don't want it to be true.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that it's probably always been true, but now we have a lot of things that have, like internet and technology to expose it.
Yeah.
So hopefully we have a chance to actually, take it out, bring it out into the light, take a look at it, see what it is, and see what we want to do with it.
I have a friend who said early on in this process that you forget that when you have a dirty kitchen and you start sweeping, it gets really filled with clouds of dust.
Right.
You've waited a long time to clean up. It's going to get really dirty and really messy in the process. So I think I'm going to go with that, bringing it out into the light. We have so much,
for us right
so
now.
much it's been not looked at. Like we've all been in an elevator together, pretending that it's all fine, not looking at it.
Right, and it's not, all right.
It's not. So
and I think the uncomfortableness that we feel is evident to that, because that's not a normal, natural thing to ignore another living being. And when we act out of ways that's not in accordance with our humanity, I think it feels strange. It doesn't feel good.
But the other thing that is that I don't think our culture has a way of dealing with conflict, not a healthy way. And so people shut it out, or they say, "Go. You need to go in your room and think about what you did. We need to separate out, time out. You know." And there isn't really, this is what I saw the last couple of years that I taught acting in a BFA program.
Ooh, I want to go to it. I want to go. I want to enroll.
Well, I left because.
But you can still teach me in my life, Fia.
That's a whole other thing. But part of it was that they didn't know how to have conflict.
Yeah.
They wanted to play these roles, but they didn't know how to actually say, this is what I need, this is what I desire, and this is what I'm having difficulty with right now. Mm-hmm. So we have these good emotions over here, and we have these bad emotions that you're not supposed to feel, mm-hmm. but that are entirely human to feel. Yeah. And so then you either punish yourself or somebody else isolates you. There's like all of this sort of stuff that happens. And the truth is that we haven't made space for our bodies. We haven't made space for our whole selves to be everything we are, and for each other to be going through all of these other things, right? So like you're talking about, so my dad and I are very different, very, very different. Mm-hmm. And it takes work. It's like what you're talking about in a different way.
She's shorter and he's a man.
Than what you're talking about with your mother-in-law, right? So because the alternative is to say, we're done. We're done, mm-hmm. and we're out. Now, and then your husband's in the middle. And
I had to do that at one point.
Yeah, well, and you might to say, we need to find and navigate a new way through this. And if somebody doesn't want a new way, then you say, okay, great, then we go in this direction. But there is something about that way about how do we disagree with each other? Yeah. Because agree to disagree is actually not really useful. I don't know.
So how do we do that?
Well,
how do we do that?
I think we have to be curious about, I think, because this is,
I love you. Curiosity is, it's critical, isn't it?
I have to be interested in how my dad that, Trump is a solution right now. Right. I have to think, wow, Dad, like what? And as a woman, how do you not see that that's going to be a major issue for me? Artists, that there is no space for me in his world. In this world y'all are creating over here, right? There's no room for women, and there is no room for whatever, so many people. Right. But he doesn't see that trickle down. And I think, well, if I go in there and try to change his mind, all we do is fight.
That's it.
That's it, right? And then I have to listen to where are you getting your information? What do you care about in your life that feels safe to him? Yes. Right? And somehow
this is the awareness. This is the awareness that I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly, mm-hmm. and that's also the third space. Mm-hmm. So I have to reach into. I
love that third space.
Say there's a third space that's not my stuff, it's not his stuff, but there's some place, and it's not compromise, because compromise feels like I've got to leave important things over here.
That's so true.
What I want to do.
I love that distinction. It's not compromise.
No, I want to get bigger. I want to get bigger so that and it's kind of like and I did this because when Brian comes in to talk to my dad, the whole space gets bigger because he doesn't have the memory and the history and the story.
Isn't that powerful?
I do not have any of the pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, you don't have the pain points. You don't have the trigger points. You don't have any of those with him.
No, so I can dance with him entirely differently.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it's just like, because
and it changes the whole space.
Right.
And that's how it's like, I've come to think of it like
I bet it allows, am I incorrect? I bet it allows you, Fia, to show up differently in that space too.
It's like an ingredient. Mm-hmm. When you add garlic into a dish, it changes the entire dish.
Absolutely. It makes it great.
Garlic, honey. Yeah, I know. Yes.
Wait, totally the garlic.
So you have a spice that's going to change the entire conversation, but you have to be willing to make space for something new to come in.
Why do you think we're not willing to do that?
Well,
why do you think we're not willing to do that?
We like our stories. It's like what you were just saying about your mother-in-law.
Gotta hold on to it. Yeah.
Because what happens is something begins to unravel, and if that's not true, then what else isn't true?
Right.
I'm going to stop right there because I'm not sure that's true. I mean, in some ways that's a true thing, but let me offer another alternative.
Give it to me, Brian.
To consider this one.
Give it to me.
You asked the question of why don't we do that, or why can't we do that? Why are people so willing basically to go, no, I'm not going to do that? What if it's not that at all? What if it's that we're not trained to do that? We don't have models for how our stories are completely fluid. If we have a model
the two don't need to be mutually exclusive. You could not have a model for it, and you could also be inclined to hold on with like iron fists. I can think of the the teachers in my life that really made a difference to me as I went on.
or the people that I ran into, 201, they tended to be softer and more open in the face of disagreement. Like they would, I can remember my acting teacher in college. You know, it's like, no, we need to do it this way. There was this argument, and he said, really, what would happen if we tried it another way? He said, well, I don't know how it'll go. Let's try it. You know, it's like that. To see a human being do it in action, not reading it, not looking it up on a wiki page, but see a human being do that and seeing how it works out. Those models are critical.
Well, but
no, they are powerful. They are. I just was thinking, I guess I was holding in the third space where both you and Fia weren't actually saying opposite things. You guys were just, I felt like actually both of these things are accurate. Both of these things are true in this third space. Like, yes, we don't have models.
Like she's wrong or she's right, I'm wrong. No, it's more like, here, let's
another thing. And I appreciate it. And that's what I saw. I was like, oh, these two things are not mutually exclusive. You have this inability to let go of your narrative, and then you also have lack of models. That's why what we see does matter, right?
I misunderstood what you said. That's my fault.
No, that's right.
I think though too is how we tell stories. When I listen to, I have there are a couple colleagues that I would really have run-ins with because there were the protagonist and the antagonist.
Yes.
It's bullshit.
Right.
Nobody fully right or fully wrong, right? I mean,
including us,
right? Every single choice we have, every single moment we have a choice to do this or do something else.
Sure.
And as soon as we begin to see stories as well, you've got the big bad wolf over here, and then you've got Little Red Riding Hood. And then you've got like all of there's very clearly the good Disney, there's a lot of good guy and a lot of bad guy. And sometimes they get a little fleshed out a little bit. So you have some, concern, but the example I always give is Iago, right? Everybody thinks of Iago in Shakespeare as absolutely, he's, here's the thing. He believes that his wife, that Amelia, is sleeping with all of his friends. He believes that. That he also then has to look at when they arrive, they also have to look at, oh, there is Desdemona and Othello beautifully like kissing each other. This amazing man who is so smart, and here's this beautiful woman. They have this fabulous conversation here, and then you see he and Amelia go like this.
Right. So context.
Right. And the other thing is he gets overlooked for a position that he's the right man for.
Right.
He's the right man for it.
He is the right man for the job.
He's the right man, and he got overlooked, and whether or not it was whatever, and so you begin to add these things on, and you think, this is stacked against me, and it's his fault. Now, I'm not saying he does the right thing, because at every choice, you can see him disintegrate and choose that instead of this over here. But, if there's so much in education and stories and the way sometimes with English and movies, and, you've got this guy and this guy. And I don't know, it's like I look at it and I think we as a culture begin to really press in this idea of people are either good or they're bad.
Or they're bad. I think do you remember the show, and you may not have watched it, but do you remember the show Mad Men?
I never watched it.
We don't watch.
So, and it's all right that you didn't. No, it's not. No, I'm joking. It's so late. But, I'm sitting in judgment of you both, okay? But it was a show I adored. But I'm curious to one of the things you said earlier. I said, why do you think, we have to be curious, but I don't know if you can teach curiosity. I don't know. I don't know. And I'd love for you guys to process that with me. But in this story, I think why I kept wondering, why do so many people love this show, Mad Men? It takes place in like the 50s. It's like total ad world. It's so sexist. It's crazy. The things they did and said, you're like, so you just have a glass full of scotch in the middle of the day? Like, this is just what you do? Like, you're smoking cigarettes. Everybody's cheating on and you're like, how was this just all right? But the thing when I really process why everybody loved Don Draper is Don Draper is a horrendous human being. And he's also a magnificent one. He's both. He is both. Don Draper, you'd end watching an episode, and you're like, I want to marry Don Draper. When can I marry Don Draper? And then the next time you watch an episode, you're like, Don Draper. You know?
How did I get married to Don Draper?
Exactly. But I think that's why people love that show, is because that show was one of the first shows in my recent memory that I can remember where the main character, the protagonist, is both evil and good. He's both brilliant and dumb. He's both kind and cruel. He's all of it, because the truth is, we are all of that.
Yeah, and you know, back to your question about can you teach it? I don't think you can teach anything. What I think you can do is invite somebody to learn the thing that they want to learn.
Yeah.
So we create spaces where learning can happen.
You can model it though too.
And
so
that's an invitation, I think, too. I mean, I don't know.
But do you think if people are not curious, do you think that if you invite them, consistently invite them into a space where they can learn, do you think that they can become people who are curious?
I think everybody's curious. I think what some people do when they say, well, I want you to be curious, what they're saying is, I want you to be curious about this particular thing that I'm curious about. I want you to be curious about me.
Right.
Instead, you know, rather than I want you to be curious, and I'm going to create a space where you can figure out what you're curious about. Because everybody's curious about something. But there isn't always space for the thing that they're curious about, because we've got ideas about what people should care about.
Sure.
Or what they should be thinking, or things like that. So
you're challenging me, because I'm thinking when I say that people aren't curious, because in my head, I'm like, Fia, I don't know if you're going to change my mind on this, sister. I see people in my life who I'm like, they are not curious.
It's really funny.
But they are. They're just not curious about the things you
want. That's what I was thinking.
I'm going to stop you right there, because guess who's not curious about those people? That would be you.
Oh, that's so true.
I know. You know, don't you hate that?
I don't like you anymore, Brian.
That's okay. That's fine. I had you for 20 years. That's good. We're done.
Yes, no, but that's exactly right. I think that's the challenge. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. They're not curious. The things that I think are very important are people and their stories. So when I don't see people curious about people and their stories, I chalk them up as, I'm kind of wrong. I chalk them up as non-curious and also maybe unintelligent. How about that one? It's not good, but I'm being honest.
But here's another way to look at it, though, too, is that if we think, about how many people there are on the planet, that we don't want to be curious about all the same things, because then certain things would get overlooked. So if you think about the charities that really move your heart, I want them to be different than mine.
Yes.
Because that way I know everybody's covered.
You just helped me in my marriage, girl. Because my husband is not overly curious about people. But you know what he's very curious about? Numbers and what they do with each other and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, take the 1 plus the 5. Hopefully you get 6, And, but so I think that is helpful, like to give interest to that which he is curious about, and not chalk him up as lacking curiosity.
Yeah, we need people to, I want my accountant, I need people because I am not a numbers person either.
Nor am I.
Oh, wow, I so appreciate people that are.
Yeah.
But then we have to be graceful with ourselves and say, I'm not curious about certain things.
Right. Right.
When I used to have work with a bunch of studio artists, it was interesting, because I would design a piece, and then I'd say, so here's what I'd like you to work with. This is the template. I don't want the template to be exact, but I'd like you to work with this. And it just was frustrating no end for quite a while, because they would come back with something that wouldn't look at all like the template. And I'd go, I just don't get why they can't replicate what I'm talking about. And until I stopped that thing where I decided they just were not that bright.
Right.